Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Kyler Canastra.
And I'm Shaheen Samavati. We're your hosts of the Content Mix podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about marketing localization and when it makes sense to translate content versus create new content from scratch.
And marketing localization is the core of what we do at Vera Content. So both Shaheen and I have a lot of things to talk about regarding this topic. So I definitely think we're going to have a really interesting episode today.
Definitely. So let's just jump right into it. I mean, first of all, let's get our terms straight. There's a lot of terms for adopting content from one language to another. Translation, transcreation, localization are really common ones. So maybe Kyler, you can start out by telling us a little bit about what's the difference between these terms.
Yeah, for sure. Because this definitely comes up on a daily basis, I think, whenever I'm talking to clients or new clients or anyone interested in our business. And I think a lot of people around the world are very familiar with what translation is, which is obviously taking a message in one language or a text in one language and then translating it or reinterpreting it in the other language. So I think everyone's really familiar with that term, but a lot of times when I say transcreation, a lot of people don't know what that means. Localization, I think, is coming more and more popular, I think, especially with social media content and how the world's becoming more globalized. But I think translation describes the craft and what we do. However, I think transcreation and localization are taking that one step further. So obviously with transcreation, you have two words there, trans from translation and then creation from creative writing. And this is what we really love doing at Vera Content is basically translating, but taking it one step further in terms of you don't have to stick 100% to the original text, which in translation is called the source text. So a lot of times in more standard translations, say like with a financial text, for example, you might want to not be so creative because it's very straightforward information and the information is what's more, I guess, in a financial text, the numbers and the data, that's more important than actually like the way that's transmitted in a creative, fun, tone or style. Those things aren't really taken into consideration. But with projects such as with transcreation, where you really want to take the messaging that you've built or like the whole concept and style and tone that you've created in your original language. When you want to transmit that in other language, it's not an easy task and it's not always so straightforward. So with transcreation, translators are able to take text and really put their own twists on them so that the same message resonates in a new market and in the target audience. So I think a lot of times, for example, with expressions is a good example of that. So like a lot of times you'll see in a creative marketing copy, using a play on words or using local expressions that really are, punny or button for that market. They don't translate as well into another language. So giving the linguists that are working on a translation the capability to like take that idea and create it in a way that it's the same, like if it's a play on words, like the same idea, but then transmitting that in their own language. So a lot of times, like you can see in brands using alliteration, for example, like if they use alliteration in a copy, then you can't, obviously it's not the alliteration. So using the same first letter for every word in a sentence is not going to work in a different language because the words are different. So how do you translate that into that market? So a lot of it involves creative writing for sure.
Yeah. And there was a really great example of that in a previous episode that you did with one of our translators, Megan Gardner, like about this pop song that we transcreated.
Yeah. So we actually worked on translating or transcreating the so we had to do it for subtitles because it was like a Spanish song that was going into a large global market. And it was important to have it in a global English that people could understand. But it was also like, that song, the original artist really it's very creative in Spanish when it comes to her lyrics. And for us, that was really important to capture all the imagery, but also be just as creative as her in the original, in the translated subtitles and lyrics in this case. So like that was a challenge, but that it's on our website too, if you want to check it out, the case study. But I think that was a really cool example of transcreation because not only were we taking a text and putting it into English, but we actually had to create the same imagery and ideas and concepts in English that was understood by a global audience. So that was a really cool project to work on.
And then there was also some localization that went into that. And maybe you can explain a little bit what localization means to you and like what's the the difference between localization and transcreation.
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely overlap, of course.
There's definitely overlap. We were talking about that before, and before we started the episode, and how, yeah, basically like they go hand in hand. But I think localization is really it's like the craft of taking like text and making sure that it's. I'm trying to think like a good example, but like when you're looking at, I don't know, some things in terms of like technical text, for example, I don't know, thinking about.
Well, you were talking about the nutrition facts,
Yeah,
for example.
a product or nutrition facts, like so, like if
that
you
are different from one country to another.
Exactly. So, like sometimes, like if you're selling a product that there's some legal implications involved, for example. So, like we're talking about nutritional labels, like the U.S., for example, versus the EU. Obviously, there's a lot of difference in terms of regulation. So, like localization is kind of taking all those things into consideration. So you can't just say, well, if it works in the US, I'm going to just put it into the EU market, because there could be a lot of consequences to that in terms of legal consequences, or the things just don't work those things aren't accepted in the target in those markets. So I think localization is really making sure that you are, transmitting that information in a way that's like understood and allowed in the target market as well.
Yeah, at least like takes the entire context into account, because like I think localization can go from everything from like, of course, the details, and I mean you have to look at the format of the phone numbers and addresses. You have to look at like you're saying, like making sure that whatever you're saying is relevant to the local context in terms of the laws, in terms of people's attitudes there, and maybe like. Yeah. I
was just going to say, like with, it also involves like having people like, working in that target audience, but then in that market, people that understand the market and what's going on. So that could be like political and social factors. I think an example that came up, and we included it in a newsletter recently, was how we work with a social media account that had a presence in Turkey, I think. And that was during the wildfires in Turkey. Like we had all this planned content to be posted on social media. And then the person that was managing that account for us, who localizes that content, was like, we can't do any of this right now because people in my country are like really going through a crisis. And we were able to adapt the content to be more, to have it resonate with the people there who are really going through a difficult time. So I think like localization also, it's considering those things like social and political factors, and what is going to work in the market and what's not. So it's kind of having that expert knowledge about the market as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we say that what we do is marketing localization, it really is a combination of creative translation and localization in general, because what we're doing, marketing content just tends to be creative. It requires that extra mile of just not, some types of translations, for example, legal translations, medical translations, the priority is accuracy, and absolutely the translated text needs to convey exactly what it said in the original text. But when it comes to marketing translation, that's often not the case. It's about what's the message you want to get across for each audience that you're trying to reach. And it might not be exactly the same for every audience. So you do need to adapt that.
Exactly. Even thinking like
totally different content in some cases. Yeah.
Like recipes is a really good example of of content that needs to be localized, because recipes you think are very straightforward, and yes, they are very procedural, and you step by step, you should follow a recipe. Anyone can get it. But say you're doing a recipe and then you want to put it into France, you want to have that recipe into French, and you want French people to be working on it. Well, if you make sure like the units of measurement are accepted in that country, you need to also consider the products. So like sometimes you might have a recipe that in the UK, for example, you have access to a certain product that you can use, but if in France they don't have access to that, you have to make an equivalent to it. So like you said, I think all of these things go hand in hand. And sometimes in a certain project, you might lean more, it might be more transcreation and localization and less, or you might have to do this translation, but there might be aspects of localization that go into that as well. So kind of you can't do one without the other in a way. But I think in terms of how far you want to go with transcreation, that depends on what the brand is. And then I think in marketing, like you said, we see that a lot of people want to take that extra step. So because you're really trying to market your product or your brand to someone that really feels passionate about it. You want to build that passion for your brand.
Absolutely. I totally agree about food is a tricky one, because also when it comes to creating marketing content around food products or articles about food topics. We've done a lot of that, and it's the terminology around food can differ so much as well from like one market to the next, even though it's the same language.
Exactly.
So it's really interesting.
I think
very fun to work.
It is fun, and I think that like Shaheen and I are both Americans that live in Europe, and that's something that like recipes, for example, like us, if we use an American recipe, everything's different. I remember, I just think I just bought, this is so random, but I did buy like measuring cups that are like localized for both. So, you know, like 1 cup equals this many milliliters, stuff like that, because it's hard with recipes. If you want to cook something in Europe, then or obviously outside the US, when no one else uses Fahrenheit, then you have to like you have to localize your recipe in order to be able to.
I actually have an app for that takes all my American recipes and turns everything into into metric system.
But that's basically what we do. My recipe. Yeah. But I think that's what we do. Essentially, that's a very simple example of like, okay, recipes, but I think that's what we do with words, essentially, which is really cool. Now, I think a lot of times we see that people are not confused, but they're unsure about like if they're launching a blog or a social media channel in a new international market. They're not the easiest option, I think, and they think so too, is to take the content from the global channel and translate that for the new market. So Shaheen, when do you think that approach works? Because I wouldn't say it works for everyone, but it does work in certain cases.
Yeah, so I think like overall topic here is like, when can you use existing content and just like translate it or transcreate it, and when do you need to go like actually create new content for a market? And I think there's a lot of cases where you can use the same content essentially and translate it. I think like some degree of localization is usually needed. I mean, pretty much always needed. There's some degree of localization happening in any translation, basically. But I think, yeah, obviously like your general web content, if it's global content, I mean, but you want to be have it available for all the markets that you operate in, it obviously makes sense to keep that the gist of that messaging the same and to translate it. I mean, product pages, for example, if the product is exactly the same in the different markets, you might want to use the same content. Even blog content can be reused, even social media content as well. I mean, generally what we see clients do is a mix of translation and creating new content for the market as needed. So it really depends on the strategy that the company's following. But yeah, for example, with blog content, like SEO needs to be taken into account and needs to be localized, even if the base content is the same. So that's
exactly. That's also like when localization is needed. Yeah, because I think a lot of times people forget that. Like if you're doing keyword research for SEO in one market, then it's not you can't just translate the keywords. You have to do the whole market research that goes behind it, and get the target, like the keywords for the target market, and then try to implement them into the blog post that sounds natural. So that's like a craft within itself. So that's like involving a lot of transcreation and localization into a task that, okay, maybe the blog post is simply the translation of it, but you might have to take the extra step to make sure that you're implementing the keywords in a way that sounds natural to the reader so that it gets optimized and is number one in Google in that market. So it can be
absolutely
a lot of different options and aspects to that. It's not very like black or white. I think that's what we're trying to like. It's clearly obvious that these things aren't as black and white. It's a lot of it's case by case, but I think a lot, like you said, like it makes sense to, you know, on a website, like if you're translating a website, your messaging is going to be the same, more or less. Your about page, your services. So I don't think you need to like you can, though. I'm not going to say you can't, but to transcribe and that or localize is not 100% priority. But I do think like,
well, I mean, like localization and transcreation is part of the translation process. If it's a marketing translation, of course, it's going to have some level of creativity. But the thing about like creating new content, like obviously you don't need to recreate the wheel where it's not necessary. That's adding like extra effort and extra expense, and you should only do that if it's actually merited. Like if you have a reason to create totally different content, right?
If you have a product that you only sell in one country, for example, that makes sense to create new content for that. Now, on the flip side, Shaheen, when is it necessary to create totally new content for a market? So I just mentioned that example, but I guess if you have any other ideas or.
Yeah, so I mean, so there's definitely cases, and we work with like a lot of clients who do choose to make tailored content for different markets. I think it depends on your business strategy and how different business you're doing in the different markets. So if you're selling exactly the same thing in the same way and the context is the same, then you can probably reuse more content. But like if your product offering has to change because of something in that market, then of course you have to change your messaging around that. Also, it could just be like we're saying, like attitudes towards a particular product, like say you're selling alcohol and like the attitude towards alcohol in that country is totally different, or the types of alcohol they drink there are different, and you're trying to emphasize a new product category maybe that's not popular there. I don't know. I'm coming up with random stuff.
No, it's true though. But I mean, like, if you're like trying to sell vodka, I know it's alcohol, but like in a market that people don't really drink that, you might want to create content.
Yeah, selling vodka in Russia probably isn't the same as selling vodka in a place where they don't drink
a lot of alcohol. Yeah, so it's like you really have to take those things into consideration. But I also think like it depends on the platforms too that you're using. So I feel like with social media, for example, like all the different social media platforms that maybe we know are more popular in one country versus the other. So it might make sense to invest, in creating content for Twitter or for TikTok in a target market that's the most popular platform to use. And I think demographic is another one that comes up as well. It's like, if you're really targeting to a certain demographic, you have to look to see like what's the trends in terms of how they consume their content. So maybe one demographic might prefer to read long form content as a blog. While, if you're trying to target to a younger generation, we see the trend now is with like Instagram and TikTok, that's more visual content. So you really have to, and that also would impact how much, if you're transcreating, for example, how much you want to transcreate. Because if you're targeting a younger audience, they might want something that resonates more with them personally as well. So there's so many different factors that come into play.
Totally. Yeah. And I think it comes back to like the, what your overall strategy is, your marketing strategy. And like you said, if you're deciding to focus on certain content platforms in one market versus another, obviously you would have to create different content for that platform, because every platform is different in terms of the way the content is formatted and all that. Of course, you can repurpose, but that means that there's a lot of creation involved in that.
Exactly.
And then, okay, so we're talking like generally, I think it would be a lot easier to conceptualize if we give some concrete examples. So maybe you can share an example where we've had to create original content for a client for a particular market.
Yeah. So actually, I think many people know, but I have been working at Very Content for a while, and I worked as a project manager for a couple of years. And one of my projects was working with Spotahome, which is a global real estate platform. And it was interesting because a lot of the content we did, because it was this global real estate platform, was originally in English, because they were like, like with real estate listings and different landing pages for the website. However, we had this really cool opportunity to work on a project that was targeted towards landlords in each country. So like not their like client, I guess, when people looking for real estate, but the people who are sharing their real estate listings on the platform. And that project required working in 6 languages, because that involves SEO keywords for blog posts. So we wanted to do blog posts in English, Spanish, Italian, German, French, and Portuguese. So we were presented with the keyword research for each market and the topics. And now it was very important for us to have original content here, because as we know, landlord laws in every country are extremely different. And I think in a place like Europe, where, it's very, the continent is very condensed in that sense, but if you cross a border, it's going to be totally different. So we were able to work, it made total sense to work with original content by creators that were living in those markets that understood landlord rules and laws. So a lot of it, they did different posts on how to list your property, or, how to deal with tenants and stuff like that. And that's obviously going to be so different because of the laws in each market. So I think in that project, we worked in 3 weeks, we were able to produce 30 landing pages in 6 languages. And this is a really cool experience, because every post was obviously the same topic, and with more or less, the keywords were similar, but different at the same time. But the product itself was extremely different. So
the end result, you mean?
The end result, yeah.
So they were given a similar briefing, similar topic, but I mean, the same topic, basically similar briefing, maybe with some different keywords, but then, but the actual end result ended up being a totally different article, because of the contextual differences in each market.
Exactly. Right? So it was like really cool to see how, because they really wanted to invest in like the quality localized content, because, you know, when looking for a partner abroad, it's so different. Like all the rules are different, and it's just, you really like, if you want to like communicate, even like how like landlord relations work in countries. So not just laws. I think like the way a landlord, I think in different countries, that's different. The expectations for a landlord and a tenant are different. I feel like some countries a landlord might be the one that's expected to fix everything or like keep on top of the apartment, while in some other countries, the tenant's the one that's, and so it's like, you have to capture those cultural differences that aren't just so easy if you just did a translation, because that would be lost. So I think even the way you address an audience too, I think changes in those. So I'm thinking of those languages for like ones I can speak about, Spanish and Portuguese, for example. I think Portuguese is a much more formal language. So I think the relationship between a tenant and their landlord is going to be much more formal. So I think the way the writers approached those posts were with that, keeping that in mind, while I think Spain's a bit more, it's informal in that sense. So like, you're not only just, like I emphasize that again, it's not just like the rules and the laws and all that stuff. It's more about even how the relationship works in each market between landlord and tenant. So it was a really cool project to work on, I have to say, a really cool result. Mm-hmm.
I was just curious, like what some of the topics were, but I was just looking it up. It was, for example, like how much can I rent my property for? Some tips on like setting the pricing, how to prepare your apartment for rent, and things like that were kind of
pricing too. That's a big one as well. And how you can present that price in different markets is different, and like the expectations about deposits and agency fees comes up a lot, stuff like that. So it was really cool to see how that all came together, for sure. Now, I'm trying to think, another project that's kind of a good example for this is a more recent one. And we're working with a company called Current Foods, and they're based out of San Francisco, and they are a plant-based seafood company. And so they're obviously very familiar with the US market, and that's where they started. But because one of the founders, I'm pretty sure, and the main research developer is Spanish, they were interested in breaking into the Spanish market. And they were able to team up with a supermarket in Spain to like release their product. So we were able to kind of help them in their very initial phase, because like they had all the content in English, and they were just kind of getting their feet wet in the US market. And then now we're taking that and bringing it into Spain now, which is very interesting, because if for people who are listening and who have been to Spain or know anything about Spain, I think seafood is a very important part of the gastronomy, especially in certain regions in Spain. And Spanish people are very proud of that. So I think in the US, and I'm speaking as an American, I think we're much more familiar with like vegan and vegetarian options. And I think in Spain, and Shaheen, I think you can agree with me, like recently it's become much more of a trend. I think when we first both moved to Spain, it was very weird. Not weird. It's not weird to be vegetarian, but for Spanish people, they didn't even know what that meant.
It was unusual. Yeah.
It was unusual. That's not the right word. Right. But I remember like people being like, oh, uncommon, like to get a salad, like a mixed salad in Spain has tuna on it, for example. So like, it's this like thing. And they were like, why do you want to get the tuna off the salad? So it's a really project.
When you say you want something, a vegetarian dish, like half the time it has fish in it. Or because they just think you don't want meat, but fishes should be okay, right?
Exactly. So like we had that challenge of like, we're introducing this really cool and innovative product in a country where that's not really consumed as often, or the concept's not there. So I think a lot of times we've seen that we have to create very individualized, like local content for Spain. So for example, something that comes up is like, if we're going to adapt content from that they're using on the US, because it's for Instagram. So if they're using that in the US market, if it has like, for example, a picture of the label, the nutritional facts, like we can't include that on the Spanish page because that's different due to EU regulation. So like, even like the nitty gritty things that you wouldn't even think about, like you have to localize it, because if not, then you can also get in trouble by EU regulation, or like you're promoting something that does not exist in that market. So it's even from like the images that you use and the text you use really has to be. And I think the challenge with that has been that the brand itself in English in the US market is super creative. And they have a really cool, they're very bold with how they, with their content and how to take that and transmit that into Spanish in a way that resonates with the Spanish audience has been really, really cool. So like, it's been a really interesting experience because there's so much that goes on behind it. And also like, using play on words with like popular Spanish music, for example. We've done a couple of posts that involved different songs like that are very common in Spain and like pop culture in Spain, and then kind of playing on that to transmit a similar message into Spanish. So it's been really, really a fun product to work on. We're localizing not only words, the captions on Instagram, we're also localizing the imagery, the videos that we're using as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really good example of what we were talking about before about like kind of creating a new product category in a market that didn't have it, where maybe it's a different context for the business than their home market.
Exactly. And I think like, even if I talk about another product we work on is pop sockets, I think it's a good example because that's a product that I think in my mind, is very American. I think it actually, like, pop sockets became popular because, I don't know if I can say this, but the Kardashians were using them, and it became a big trend in the US. And when they were bringing it to the European market, people were like, what is this? Like, I had no idea what that product was. And we really had to be creative with the way that we presented the product. It was almost as if in the US, it was just like people would start. I remember being here and people just started getting them. And it was like kind of a lot of word of mouth marketing. While the European approach was like, how do we take that and like localize it for each market that we're working in? And like how do we?
It's like you're at a different starting point, because then
exactly.
At this point the content that they're creating for social media is assuming a certain level of familiarity, but we can't use that exact same content in Europe because it's just people don't know the product as well. So
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's been we've worked on a lot of different products where that's like the challenge that we're presented at the beginning of the collaboration is we have all this great content in our home market, but how do we transmit that to another market, and how do we make it work? So
and oftentimes there's also like specific situations that we want to create specific like local content around. Like I know with Current Foods, we also had like a partnership they were launching in Spain, for example, that they wanted to promote. So that was like, obviously has to be original content because we're not translating it from anything else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's really cool. And that's like when you have to make that decision a lot, I think it's the team that's working on that has that challenge every day. Like, when do we adapt or when do we create from scratch? So it's kind of this back and forth conversation. So it's, again, going back to the idea that it's not so crystal clear always in every situation. Every situation is a case by case analysis. I think you need to apply.
Do you think that like social media projects require like more original content than like more straightforward web content, I guess?
That's a good question. Because now we're seeing like a lot with social media, like viral trends, right? That go viral across borders, and it doesn't matter what language they're in. But I also think in our field, if it's marketing a certain product, then I do think you should be creating original content. Especially like we see a lot with influencers, local influencers. If you want to engage them as well, there might be content like, so yeah, there are viral trends, but there's also trends within each market that maybe you might want to hop on that train. If there's a TikTok trend, I'm thinking, I don't know, I'm not a big TikTok user personally. I recognize how important it is, but I don't use it often. But I feel like there are trends in certain countries that they have like certain sound bits they do, or like different things, and you can like play off of that for that certain market with your product by creating original content. But I guess it depends.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, so obviously like a lot of the clients we work with, we do translate or, localize, but take some base content they have in one language to use it as some of the planned content we have for social media. But I think with social media, because of its real-time nature, there's so much that you could try to plan everything, but if you want to be relevant and engaging with your audience, you have to work there in real time to some degree. So that means creating spur of the moment content, and that has to do with like, the trends that are happening in that market, the way people are reacting to your page in that market. And that often means, you end up having to create original content in that language. It's not enough just to translate.
Yeah. And that's why I think it's so like interesting what we do at Vera Content, because we work with so many collaborators that are based in the markets that we're working in. So it's like so helpful in terms of like, even if you think you might be doing a very simple transcreation, and then you have the translator coming back to you saying, oh, we shouldn't do this, or I don't like, just having that insight with people that are on the ground. I think it's also important to keep in mind as well. You want to work with people that really understand not just the language, but the market and the trends as well.
Definitely. I would say another like example that came to mind, actually, that's not social media related, but just thinking on the flip side of that, like actually a lot of B2B content that we've done is very localized, as like very we've had to create specific content for the market, because I think so much of B2B is like about case studies, and it's really important to have like local case studies that are relevant to each market. So a lot of times we have created like totally original white papers or case studies like in just one language rather than translating from one into the others.
Especially if you have a case study with like a big brand, for example, like you want to, and that's only, but that big brand's only known in Italy, then you're only going to want to do it. You don't want to waste your resources and translate it out for the markets if you don't think it's going to resonate the same. As it would in Italy, for sure.
Well, a lot of times too, it goes hand in hand with like multimedia content that they have in the local language, and watching a video in Italian translated into like English, for example, maybe they don't want to use that in the US market. Doesn't make a lot of sense. They just, use that content in the Italian market, for example.
For sure. There's a lot of different examples that I think we face on a daily basis at Vera Content, and I think that's what it makes it very interesting to work in the field that we do, because it's always new challenges every day in terms of this question comes up all the time on a daily basis of when do we transcreate and when we localize. And I think that's what makes it such a cool field to work in, because it's so collaborative in that sense. So everyone, like, it's just a lot of brainstorming, creativity that goes into it even before you produce the product itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Constant learning. That's one part of what I love about this job.
Exactly. I actually was talking to someone about it recently, about how like that's the one thing I love about working at Vera Content, is just that every day we're challenged to learn new things and understand new concepts, and you never know what the day is going to bring. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know, Shaheen, if you have any final thoughts you want to share about the topic, or I know Shaheen and I probably could talk about this all day, so I feel like I don't want to I don't know if any
yeah, I think we covered most of it. I mean, I guess the ultimate answer to the question, like, okay, when do you create new content versus when do you use what you have? It really depends. There's not a right answer, but I think we covered a lot of the ways, the things that should be taken into account, and like I guess kind of like I said at the beginning, it's like, if you can reuse your content, reuse your content. Don't create new content just for the sake of it. But I think there are a lot of circumstances where it is where it's really necessary and obviously beneficial for your brand if you really want to connect with your local audience.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to emphasize how it's good to take risks with this and try new things and test things out, because you might not know, like, there's no right or wrong answer, like you just said. So I think you want to try, if you have the resources to do so, like, okay, let's, try to localize everything, see how that works, see how our target audience reacts to that. And if it's working well, then you continue with that. If not, you can maybe just start, just doing more translation, or you want to create original content, or all these things that you can keep in mind. But I think testing is so important, because you don't really know until you try. So I think that's also a really cool thing. So, that data is important in this as well, to see like how effective things are working. So there's no right or wrong answer, but it's always good to take a risk and see what the outcome is.
Absolutely. That's a good point.
Yeah. So Shaheen, thanks again, as always, for your time, for sharing all your insight, and for being with us today. And I want to thank everyone for listening in. So for more perspectives on global content marketing, definitely check out veracontent.com/mix. And if you'd like to get in touch with either Shaheen or myself, or if you have any interesting topic for an upcoming episode, we're very open to feedback and to new ideas. Feel free to reach out to us at mix@veracontent.com, and keep tuning to the podcast for more perspectives on topics related to global content creation. I'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, everybody. See ya. Bye-bye.